Robin Ladd is talking today. She is the owner of Surpass Your Goals. She provides coaching and training to a variety of professionals and teenagers. Professionals include doctors, attorneys, realtors, and teachers. Robin helps people realize their potential and purpose while reaching higher levels of productivity and prosperity. She has a master's degree in psychology. She is credentialed as an advanced certified professional and executive coach, and is certified as a Supreme Court family mediator. She is leading for doctorate in human behavior by focusing on
Love that pen.
psychology and resiliency. So the funny thing about Robin, when I asked her to do this presentation, we were talking about different topics. I evidently wasn't listening. So when I promoted her, so crazy, right? I promoted communicating in the midst of chaos because I really thought that's what we were talking about. And when I put this on, she calls me and she's like, you know, the topic is a little different, right? And I'm like, no, really? So she did this specifically for us. This is tailored to our group. Robin?
Thank you. Quinn, actually, the topic was going to be staying calm in the midst of chaos, which was more about stress management. So she did such a good job on the write-up on Facebook, saved me time, just did the whole thing. And I was like, that's actually a pretty good topic. I should probably switch it and do that. So this is brand new just for you guys. I hope you enjoy it. So when we talk a little bit about communication, has everybody heard about the UCLA study that looked at what percentage of your communication has to do with the words you use versus body language? So when we talk to somebody, the words that we use for communication only account for 7%. 38% has to do with our tone, and then 55% is actually our body language. So when we look at the amount of miscommunication on email and text, the reason is we've stripped out the tone and then we've stripped out the body language. And that's why people try to use like emoticons to try to better communicate things. But a lot of times we emphasize our words thinking that that's what people are actually hearing. Now, if your words don't actually match your body language, what do you think people will listen to? Body language every time. And so that becomes really, really important. The other thing I want to mention in terms of communication, let's talk about tone for a second. I'm going to have you guys say the word okay, and I'm going to have you do it in different emotions. So the first one I want you to do is say okay when I tell you, as if you're really annoyed. Ready? Go ahead. Okay. Now say annoyed as if you're just delighted and surprised. Okay. Now as if you're complaining. Okay. And if you're being affectionate? Okay. I always add that just for me. It's just purely fun.
Can you get that last one again?
Affectionate. So what's really interesting is that was the same word, right? And look at how many different, I could have picked all kinds of different terms and it would have changed the meaning. And we're not always paying attention to what that meaning actually is. What do you think happens when you get really stressed out? What happens to your communication? Deteriorates, it shuts down, meaning what?
It's not really related to what you want to relay.
Right. It makes it even more difficult. So have you ever had to have a conversation with somebody who's very defensive? In the nature of the business that you guys are in, that's a very difficult transition, right? And so when you think about what you're trying to communicate, especially if it's really important information, if somebody is stressed out and they're worried, it actually impairs their ability to actually understand what's going on. So today, when we start talking about communication, I want you to think about it from two angles. A lot of times when we talk about communication, we think it's about what we're saying, but it's not. Communication is about what somebody else is hearing. And so we think we've made ourselves perfectly clear. I go into companies and organizations continuously, and that's one of the biggest complaints that leaders and managers have, is that they keep repeating themselves over and over. And so it's not them, it's that person isn't listening, or they don't understand, or something's wrong with them. But true communication means that you say what you need to say, and you verify that they heard what you intended. And when you get stressed out or when they get stressed out, it actually interferes with your ability to communicate and their ability to actually hear. So the whole purpose of today is to talk a little bit about how to overcome that so that you can have clear communication in any type of situation. I've been recently fascinated with neuroscience. I am a geek, I'll admit I'm a geek. So what's fascinating about neuroscience is because of the advancements in technology, you can actually study the brain and what's happening. So when somebody gets defensive or somebody is stressed out, it actually activates different parts of the brain. Has anybody ever heard of the term called the amygdala hijack? So the amygdala hijack is part of the limbic system, and it's basically responsible for the primitive part of our brain. The primitive part of our brain is what makes us very similar to animals. It's a knee-jerk reaction, and it's very emotional. The prefrontal cortex is this part of our brain. So this is the forehead, and then the back part is where the amygdala is deep inside. The prefrontal cortex is where we have rational thought and decision making. That's where we can be creative, that's when we can problem solve and use effective reasoning. When we get pissed off, there's no reasoning because you're activating a very different part of your brain. So a lot of times we don't realize that we've activated what's called a threat response, and that creates a level of stress. The moment that we get stressed, we have elevated levels of adrenaline and cortisol. And the ability to connect is diminished as soon as those chemicals hit. And then we really have a hard time hearing what's going on. I have one client that has a paralegal, and she's really frustrated with the paralegal. And she has, when she gets frustrated, you know. She doesn't overreact or she doesn't do anything mean, but she's got a tone that gets kind of cutting. And in that tone, if you could imagine as an employee, that's a threat, right? Like, oh my God, my boss is not happy. So she says to me, I keep repeating myself over and over and over. Well, because every time you activate that threat response, she literally can't think straight. And so you're not going to be able to retain the information. So when we go into defense mode, which means that amygdala is actually activated, we act in very different ways. One of the things that we try to do is we resort to a model that's called tell, yell, and sell. So when we feel like somebody's not understanding us, at first we're like, okay, we're going to tell them what we need, or we're going to tell them what information is available. And then if they don't hear it, we just say it louder. We don't actually change the message. We don't change the context or the tone. And then eventually we get so frustrated that we get to a point where we're yelling. And then we might take a step back and say, okay, I'm going to try a different approach. And so what I'm going to do is try to convince these people why my idea is the best. And so I'm going to sell to them and hope that they get it in that regard. And yet, if you understand how the brain works, once that threat response is activated, you can do this repeatedly. It's not actually going to change the outcome. Because what needs to happen is the person needs to feel comfortable so that they can begin to use executive functioning. Bless you. The minute that threat response is there and they're in defense mode, you're no longer working and sharing the information. You're only focused on, here's what my intention is. And a lot of times people forget that there's a difference between what your intention is to communicate and what the impact is. There's a lot of blind spots that people have, and they don't realize that what their intention is and how it's been received is vastly different. So when we go into a threat response, the person who's listening activates the amygdala, and then the amygdala is actually responsible for what's called the negativity bias. And so because the amygdala thinks, oh my God, I'm under threat. Now just imagine that we're wired to either survive, and that's it, to survive. So we either have to protect ourselves or we go towards rewards. But most of the time, if we're in protection mode, we literally feel as if it's a threat to our lives, even though it might just be a negative comment. The minute that's activated, we tend to see more and more negative. So if you've ever spoken to somebody who's angry at somebody else, and there's a neutral situation, they interpret it in vastly different ways. Because if they don't trust that person, they think everything that person done is either scheming or manipulative or somehow negative. And it's only because they're perceiving it from a different part of the brain. There's a couple biases that we have. So once that negativity part kicks in, there's a term called black and white thinking. Have you all heard of that? Black and white thinking is when there's no middle ground. It's either this or this. So I was talking to a woman who's a HR manager, and she said that she had received some feedback that some of her staff don't trust her. And I asked her what some of her goals were, and she said that she wants people to take her seriously. So I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, well, if they took me serious, when I told them to do something, they would do it. And I said, okay, and so if they're not doing it, it's because they're not taking you seriously. And she goes, right. And I said, well, is there any other interpretation for that? And in her mind, it was black and white, right? You either listen to what I do and then you respect me, or you don't. So the minute I asked, well, what other reasons might it be? Might it be that when they tell you that when you tell them that they have to have a conversation with their staff that they're uncomfortable with, maybe they're just uncomfortable. They don't know how to do it. Maybe they're avoiding it because they don't want to create a blowout. There's any number of interpretations, but black and white thinking, it's either yes or no, and it doesn't allow for possibilities. And so what it does is it limits your perspective, oftentimes to a very negative perspective. Another one is called mental filtering. So you're giving all kinds of information, both positive, both negative, and then neutral, and you just take out all the positive information and focus solely on the negative. So I was working in this one company with an administrator and a couple of the doctors. The doctors don't always have the best bedside manner, so everybody around them is constantly in a threat response. And so I was talking to one of the doctors about being able to give feedback, and I said, how do you feel your administrator's doing? He said, she's doing a wonderful job. And I was like, when is the last time that you told her that? So then I ended up talking to her like a week later, and she goes, yeah, he told me I was doing a good job. And I was delighted, like, oh, he actually saw the importance of that. She goes, yeah, I don't believe him. He's just saying that, or he wants something, and that's mental filtering. So even it literally was genuine, she couldn't even see that. And then there's overgeneralizing. Overgeneralizing is where you take one instance and then you jump to massive conclusions. And sometimes we see that when you're arguing with somebody and they have a rationale, and you're like, how did you get from this point all the way over there? And it's because they've made a series of assumptions. So those are a couple things that happen in terms of the threat response. Now let's look at in terms of survival and what we're motivated by. In terms of human behavior, we're motivated by 5 different areas. The first area are what are called mental shortcuts. When you're really tired at the end of the day, you're depleted, mentally depleted. There's only so much information that we can store at one time, so our brain likes to take shortcuts. Self-preservation, we want to protect our ego and our self-image. Forecasting the future, we love certainty. So if we can focus on what's predictable in the future, it gives us a sense of reward and pleasure. Sense of belonging, we are literally wired to connect to one another. And then the last one is the threat response, which I'll go into in a little bit. So mental shortcuts. If I were to ask you, who would you ask for help with a computer problem?
Somebody else.
Between these two. That's a mental shortcut, right? Mental shortcuts are actually what creates part of prejudice and discrimination. So we just make an assumption based off of stereotypes, but the reason we do that is actually saves mental energy. We're not aware that we're doing it. We just say, well, that would be the best decision. What if I asked you, who's smarter?
The one with the glasses, probably a model.
How we dress, how we act gives people cues in terms of whether or not we're credible. Again, another mental shortcut. So we want to be aware of some of those. One of the big ones is called an overconfidence bias. This is how we protect our ego in terms of self-preservation. If I asked everybody in this room, are you average, below average, or above average in your leadership styles, 80% of you will say above average. And if I say, are you below average, average, or above average in your driving style, 80% of you will say above average. And it doesn't matter what the topic is, we all have this sense that we're slightly better than. It's not possible for 80% to always be above, right? And so we tend to compensate and believe for ourselves that we're actually better than what we really are. And we do that because it actually minimizes some of the anxiety that we have. We also have what's called the blind spot bias, which is, even though we know that we have biases, we believe that we're above it. and that everybody else maybe has it, but not us. And the smarter you are, the more this is a bias. Because what happens is smart people think they don't have the bias, and then the bias actually becomes even more prevalent. There's also addicted to being right. You've ever heard the saying, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? Especially if you're married, right? When you are right about something, when somebody confirms for you like that you were right, you actually get a dopamine rush. And when I say addicted, literally, it hits the same part of the brain as any other chemical that makes you feel good. So if you've ever tried to interact with somebody who is dead set on being right, it's because it literally releases chemicals that makes them feel good. It makes everybody else feel crappy. But for them, they feel fantastic. And you know those people that always have to be right. It's actually self-serving in that regard. And that person has no idea that they're in that state. They're just utterly convinced that they're actually right. That's what I'm going to go through. We're going to talk about how to lower some of the defenses, right? So when the defenses are up, you're more likely going to see what somebody is motivated to or how they're actually protecting themselves, right?
I think it's that last one would be okay.
Affection? Well, I mean, if you tell the person they're right, they'll feel good. And if you... Huh? That is. And I'm going to teach you guys how to lower some of the defenses so they can hear that. The third motivator is forecasting the future. This is all about having a focus on what can we predict in the future. When you look at any time somebody is going through a significant amount of change, the future becomes unclear. And when people don't have that level of certainty, it actually evokes a threat response. We want to feel like we can predict what's going on. So a lot of times if you say to somebody, we don't have all the answers right now, but we'll have more clarity in the next week or in the next month, that still gives them a little sense of certainty so that they can begin to relax a little bit. The fortune telling error is the people who don't know what's going to happen in the future, but then they just believe that everything horrible is going to work and the sky is falling. So they just think all bad things are actually going to happen. The other one is called the mind reading bias. This is where you're trying to get a sense of certainty or a sense of control in the future so that when you're interacting with somebody, you're like, oh, I've got them all figured out. I know what they're going to do. And then, again, it's almost related to addicted to being right. They're so certain what that other person is doing or what they're going to do because it gives them a sense of control. But in reality, you don't know. You're making assumptions all over again, and that's another bias. The fourth one has to do with a sense of belonging and how we actually connect. Anybody ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? The hierarchy of needs basically says on the bottom, you have to attend to basic needs, food, shelter, and water. And until that level is met, you can't progress into connecting with people, self-esteem, love, and then self-actualization. Well, the studies now actually show that sense of belonging trumps basic needs. So if you feel like, if somebody has experienced a level of social rejection, and by the way, it resonates in the brain the same as physical pain. So if somebody feels like they're not part of the group and they're actually being rejected, you have to imagine that that is worse than not having food, shelter, and water. That's how much that resonates with an individual. So when we want to eliminate some of the defenses, a lot of it has to do with how do we actually connect with people. The rejection in terms of in-group and out-group is really prevalent, and a lot of times people don't even realize. If I was having a conversation with Quinn, I was talking to somebody the other day in a networking event, and somebody else came up to be a part of it. And we were engaged in a conversation, and we didn't welcome that person in. That's a high level of rejection. It wasn't intentional, but that person then is going to have that threat response activated because they felt like they were part of the out-group. And you know that if you go on a playground and you watch little kids playing and then there's a little kid that's left out, we're like, oh, like it's heartbreaking, right? Because we understand on an unconscious level how devastating that actually is. So the next one is looking at how do we actually remove the threats, which goes to your question in terms of how do we actually get people on the same page. I just wanted to share with you, a lot of it has to do with how we set the tone there's a term called priming for trust, which is how you set the tone to let people know that it's safe and that it's comfortable. I worked for this guy under a contract for a really long time, and we would have weekly calls. And he almost always said, okay, I don't want you to take this the wrong way. And my heart would drop. And then whatever he said afterwards, I was like, it's not even that bad. Why do you keep doing that? So at one point, and I didn't even understand how physiologically that was happening, and now that I do, and I was like, that was horrible, because instantly he put me in a threat state, which meant I wasn't even hearing clearly. So sometimes we're not really aware of what's the foundation that we're setting. If he had said something like, I want to have your input in something, I need to discuss something that I need your help with, it wouldn't have evoked a threat response. And that basically what he was saying. But why he said, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, was it like every time. So in order to, sorry, this one is pixelated. In order to remove a threat response, one of the things that we can do personally for ourselves is identify what's triggering the threat response. And the threat response is always going to be related sometimes to one or multiple of these. So if our ego is at risk and our status is being challenged, it'll evoke a threat response. Now let me tell you how insidious this is. I went to an event, the Oyster Roast, they have every year for like attorneys, and they have all these food stations and all this alcohol. It's like a big party for attorneys. That's probably not how they describe it, that's how I see it. And so at the end, they judge all the food vendors to see who won. And there was this guy walking around and he had a ribbon on that said judge. And I was like, I don't know if he's like a judge for the food or he's like a judge. But it didn't matter, I just kept on. And then later on, this woman I knew introduced me to her husband, who, by the way, was a judge. And my friend there, who was an attorney, instantly was like dumbfounded, like didn't even know how to say hello, couldn't carry on a conversation, useless. And I started talking ad nauseum to him in a fascinating conversation about jury selection and all kinds of stuff. And so she says to me, I don't understand how it's just so easy for you to talk to the judge. Well, the judge doesn't threaten my status. I'm not an attorney, right? For her, instantly having a judge in front of her, threat response. So sometimes we don't even know, like authority and position, how that's triggering other people. Certainty, I mentioned a little about. We want to know that what's going to happen in the future. The other one is autonomy. Have you ever worked for somebody that's a micromanager? That's nonstop threat response. Relatedness. This is related to the in-group, out-group. We want to feel like we're similar to people. And the minute we feel like we can connect with other people, there's a sense of relatedness. And if we feel we're different from people, it activates the threat response. And then the last one is fairness. If you've ever worked on a group activity and you felt like you did more work than somebody else, it'll make you irate. And that's because it activates that. It's not fair. So for ourselves, we can identify what that is. But also in terms of the SCARF model, do you think it's possible that if somebody else gets defensive with us, we could identify which one we think was triggered?
It's possible.
You could. And so do you think that if you knew what was triggering them, that would alter?
Yes.
Why?
Because now you have a sense of understanding.
Yeah.
You can relate to it.
Exactly. So what you've done is you've put yourself in their shoes, and so you understand why they're defensive, and so you can approach it in a different perspective. But what's fascinating is the minute you put yourself in somebody else's shoes, you're actually activating empathy.
Yes.
And empathy actually releases oxytocin. Oxytocin is called the cuddle hormone, or the hormone that's released after sex. And what's interesting is all of emotions are contagious. So if you all of a sudden become empathetic, it releases the chemical for them. So just identifying why they're defensive versus trying to tell, yell, and sell and make them not defensive will actually help them calm down. A lot of the work that I've been doing is a certification program called Conversational Intelligence. That's why I was excited to do this, because I was able to draw a lot from this. And this whole program talks about how to lower the defenses. So what we want to do is intentionally activate different parts of the brain in order to eliminate some of those defenses, and then we actually want to enhance trust. One of the ways to do that, I mentioned we release oxytocin, but when we get somebody going from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex and we activate that part of the brain, trust is actually centered in the prefrontal cortex and distrust is actually in the amygdala. So if you activate the prefrontal cortex, you can actually enhance trust because they literally reside in different parts of the brain. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, oftentimes we're trying to make our point, and so we repeat it over and over and over again. If you take a step back and think, how do I restore trust, you'll find that it actually shifts the entire dynamic. One of the ways to do that is through compassion and empathy, like we just mentioned. So looking at a picture, by the way, like this, when you go, it releases oxytocin. It makes you happy just looking at it. And you can actually look at positive images as a way to shift what's going on in your brain. It's really that simple, but you have to be intentional about wanting to do that. Sometimes we like being angry and we like being frustrated, and so we kind of sit in that situation. Yeah, if we really don't, there's a lot of really simple things that we can do to activate different areas of our brain. When we're interacting with somebody, one of the things that we can do is ask questions for which we don't have answers. There's a difference when you're asking somebody a question because you're judging them versus you're curious. It's a very different interaction. When you're curious, it's kind of like, tell me more about that, or what do you mean by that? That's different than, what do you mean? And the minute you create that level of judgment, people are going to shut down. It just happens that quickly. But if you take the time to say, let me understand where you're coming from, and you ask questions so that they can share more information, it will actually enhance the trust. So that means that we're actually listening to connect. We're not listening so that we can get our point across. We're listening at first to just connect, because we know that we cannot get our point across if they're in a hijack. So we have to restore the trust. We have to get people on the same page. So our main objective in any communication is to make sure that we're on the same page. What do you think happens when you're having a really bad day and you go to sit? If I come home and I've had a really bad day, my dogs know. I don't have to tell them I had a bad day. They know. And I love the people that say, oh, I keep it contained. People don't really know. Right. So yeah, even if you don't say anything, and even if it has nothing to do with the person, you're actually antagonizing people, not even realizing it. 3 strategies to get people unstuck. So if they're stuck on that they want to be right, or you're stuck on wanting to be right, or they're just defensive, there's 3 different conversations that you can have with them. The first one is to reframe the situation. Reframing the situation is looking at it from a different perspective. So the woman that said, I want them to take me seriously, and I said, well, maybe it's their own insecurity in having a difficult conversation. That was a reframe. And I didn't actually give her the information. I said, what other explanations could there be? Because I wanted her to actually problem solve for that. So she came up with the reframe herself. And that changes, you look at it from a different perspective. The other one is to actually refocus. If we know that we have a tendency to focus on the negative information, then we can take a step back and actually focus on the whole situation, or focus on a different element, and that different element will give us a different perspective. And then the third component is to redirect. Redirect is whatever that person is focusing on that's got them. Have you ever talked to somebody that is so frustrated? So we can literally redirect them off on a different conversation until they kind of downregulate some of those emotions. What's really interesting is when you experience a hijack and you get really frustrated and you have elevated levels of cortisol, do you know how long that stays in your brain, in your body? 30 hours. So if you've ever felt like you calmed down a little bit and you were getting better and then you got triggered right away, it's because it hasn't completely subsided. So one of the things that I do if I'm actually upset and I need to make a big decision is I used to give myself 24 hours. Now I try to give myself 2 days. And in those 2 days, I literally have to calm down. Because if I'm ruminating about it, then clock starts over. That cortisol is still there. So that's refocusing. There's a program that I created called Bounce, which is how to actually develop resiliency, so that when you're stressed out, there's certain skills that you can do to manage stress and to overcome adversity even better. So if you want information, please see me on that. Any questions? Cool. Do I got time for questions? No questions?
What was that thing you clicked out of it at the end? You have a session or something you're doing?
Yeah, it's a bounce program where we get to practice certain skills to for you to downregulate yourself and not be hijacked all the time.
What's the acronym stand for?
Bounce is that's a good catch. So bounce is I've done my research in school is all about developing resiliency, and of all the research I've done, the traits that actually enhance resiliency is what bounce stands for. So B is belief, sense of belief, bigger purpose. O is optimism. You can literally teach yourself to be optimistic, and people have a blind spot that they think they're optimistic when they're really not, because it's what you're saying to yourself. U is understanding self. N is nurturing connection, social support. C is compassion. And then E is esteem and efficacy. Cool. Thank you, guys.
Hey, Ron.